Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. David lived on Readin Close, a quiet, sun-drenched street in Readin, where the earth was always red and stubborn, where the gutters smelled like forgotten dreams after rain, and the air, even when silent, whispered stories. His house stood at the end of the close, flanked by thick hibiscus bushes and an old mango tree that dropped fruit whether in season or not. Children called it the mango that never sleeps. It was fitting really, because neither did David. Not in the way others did. He didn't toss and turn or snore. His nights were always awake, sometimes with music humming from the background, sometimes with soft laughter echoing through the walls, laughter that never seemed to belong to one woman. In the beginning, no one said anything. Readin was a place where people learned to mind their business early. A compound could catch fire, and neighbors would wait until they smelled burnt stew before they peeked through the window. But David, he made it difficult to ignore him. His house had become the sanctuary of every child in the compound. His front door, never truly closed, swung open with the same ease as his smile. At any given time, you'd find no less than 5 children inside, some sprawled on his polished tiles watching cartoons, others drinking Capri Sun like it flowed from the tap. He had a small fridge, always stocked, and somehow he never ran out of cookies. His living room had more school bags than chairs. It became the unsaid rule of the street. If you needed a place to cool off, laugh, escape homework, or even do it, you went to Uncle David's house. He wasn't rich in the sense that made people jealous. He had no flashy car, no shiny wristwatches, no security man at his gate. But everything about him felt comfortable, clean, well-arranged, like the kind of man who folded his clothes by color and laid his bed even when he knew he'd return to it in an hour. His fans worked. His generator never coughed. His food never burnt. Women noticed these things, especially women like Mrs. Bola, who sold Accra down the road and often complained that her husband couldn't boil water. Or Madame Clara, who lived just across the fence from David, raising her twin daughters alone with the sort of patience that came from heartbreak. The compound was a melting pot of whispered rumors, but it never boiled over because David carried himself like someone who didn't need to defend anything. When Juliet first arrived, she came in a red taxi that announced itself with a faulty horn and a cracked headlamp. She stepped out like someone who was used to people staring, hips rolling like music in slow motion, the sun catching the shimmer in her lip gloss. Juliet wasn't from around here. You could smell Lagos in the perfume that clung to her like entitlement. From her long braids to her manicured nails, she was every inch the kind of woman that would make men reconsider loyalty. David greeted her at the gate like she was a long-lost queen, and in that moment, even the air between them paused to admire the chemistry. Neighbors looked away, pretending not to notice, but everyone did, especially the children. The first time Juliet stayed over, the twins came to play the next day, pretending to need help with math homework. Nita had held up her exercise book with shaky hands while Nina climbed onto the couch like she belonged there. Juliet had smiled politely but said nothing, her legs folded under her on David's couch as she scrolled through her phone. David, ever the host, had helped the girls with their sums while Juliet sipped pineapple juice through a straw. That day passed quietly, but it was the beginning of something that never quite sat right with the twins. They started to come by more often, sometimes without knocking, sometimes hiding behind the window. They never said much, just watched, always watched, and whenever Juliet was there, they became extra silent, as if they were memorizing something they couldn't explain. But Juliet didn't mind them. She liked the attention, even if it came from children. She began to spend more weekends. Her bag grew heavier with each visit, from a small tote to a rolling suitcase. The shift was slow, like a song fading into another without you realizing the first had ended. David adjusted to her presence like water adjusting to a new container. Smooth, effortless, but underneath that ease, a seed had been planted, a quiet seed of disruption, and no one, not even David, realized it had started to grow. By the third weekend, the compound had become divided. The older women watched Juliet with narrowed eyes, their mouths tightening every time her laughter drifted across the fence. Some said David had been better off alone. Others said she was changing him too quickly. But the children didn't care. They still came, though their laughter grew shorter, less wild. Something about Juliet's presence put invisible lines in the air, lines no one crossed, but everyone felt. Then one Saturday afternoon, under a sky that looked like it was holding back tears, everything shifted. It was just after lunch. Juliet and David were sprawled on the couch, their limbs tangled like power cables, Netflix casting flickers of light on their skin. A gentle breeze pushed the curtains aside. That was when David saw them. Two small heads at the window. Frozen. Wide-eyed. As if the world had paused with them. For a split second, he didn't move. Couldn't. The image was too strange, too quiet, too real to be accidental. The twins weren't playing. They weren't smiling. They were watching him. Watching Juliet. Watching the story unfold like a silent movie only they were allowed to narrate. David sat up, heartbeat suddenly louder than the TV. Outside, the street hummed with distant voices, birds calling to each other from electric poles. But inside that room, time held its breath. The air turned cold. Juliet noticed nothing. She kept laughing at the show. David's hands trembled as he rose. Because he knew. Somehow, he knew this wasn't just innocent curiosity. It was something deeper. Something that had been waiting. Watching. And now it had arrived. David did not open the door immediately after spotting the two heads. He stood still for a moment, long enough to feel the weight of realization settle like dust on untouched furniture. His breath caught in his throat as if the very air had turned against him. Juliet, oblivious, reached out and ran her fingers down his arm, laughing at a joke from the movie that had long since stopped mattering. David didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on the window. The curtain danced lightly as if mocking him, revealing again the two little silhouettes, still there, still watching. Nina and Nita. Their small round faces, framed by identical afro puffs, peaked with the eerie calmness of children who knew what they were doing, but didn't fully understand why. There was something unsettling about the way they stood, completely motionless, as if their bodies had turned to stone. David blinked. They didn't flinch. He rose suddenly, his movements stiff, the air around him thick like smoke. Juliet sat up slightly, confused, but said nothing. David crossed the room, unlatched the door, and swung it open with a force that startled the day itself. "Come back here," he barked, voice cutting through the compound like a blade. The twins, caught in mid-sprint, froze. Their little legs wobbled as they turned slowly, guilt written in invisible ink all over their bodies. They walked back with the hesitance of criminals facing a judge, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground, as if the concrete had become more interesting than truth. David stepped aside and let them in, his face hardening not with anger, but with something else, something unspoken and dangerously close to fear. The room fell quiet the moment the twins stepped inside. The TV played on, the characters moving and speaking, but their voices felt far away, like echoes from a distant life. Juliet's eyes shifted from David to the girls, curiosity knitted in her brow. She was used to the children in the compound running in and out, but something about this moment made her sit up straighter. David crossed his arms and looked at the girls. "Were you peeping into my window?" he asked, his voice low, calculated, not yet angry but already sharp. Nina looked at Nita. Nita looked at her feet. They shook their heads in perfect sync, a motion so eerily identical it seemed rehearsed. David's jaw clenched. "If you lie," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I will beat both of you, and you will never come to this house again." That was the blow. That sentence struck deeper than any threat of pain. The girls froze, lips trembling. To be denied access to David's house was unthinkable. It was their favorite place, their sanctuary, the one spot in the world that offered cartoons, juice, and a moment of calm. The silence between them grew heavy. Finally Nina whispered, barely audible, "Our mummy sent us." David blinked once, but said nothing. Juliet let out a sharp laugh that broke the tension like glass against tile. "Wait, what?" she said, chuckling. "You're telling me their mum sent them to spy on you?" The twins nodded slightly, then stopped, unsure if they should have. Juliet laughed again, but David didn't. He stood still, breathing quietly, as a chill ran down his spine. He suddenly felt like a man being watched not just by children, but by ghosts of his own making. David ushered the twins out without another word, and they obeyed, their little slippers making soft pattering sounds as they walked away like punished cats. When he closed the door, Juliet turned to him with a half-smile, still finding the situation amusing. "That woman again," she said, shaking her head. "She doesn't give up, does she?" David didn't answer. He sat down slowly, eyes still on the door, thoughts running in every direction. He knew Clara wasn't the kind of woman who did things on impulse. Her silence was always intentional, her actions layered like the skins of onions. She had never outright said the words, "I want you to myself," but her behavior made the message as clear as a midday sun. Sending her children to spy, if that was indeed what had happened, wasn't a joke. It wasn't curiosity. It was a move. A message sent with small feet and big eyes. Juliet was still talking, ranting about how some women don't know when to move on. But David wasn't listening anymore. His mind replayed every interaction with Clara over the past few months. The nights she'd come over in silence. The mornings she'd left before anyone could see. The gifts. The compliments. The looks. How had he missed it? Or had he simply ignored the signs? A strange guilt began to creep in, not because of what he had done, but because of what the children had seen. He had crossed a line, and they had witnessed it. And worse, they had names and faces, and they lived just across the fence. That evening, David stood outside under the mango tree, staring at the twilight sky as crickets chirped and streetlights began to flicker on like stars trying to compete. The compound was quiet except for the occasional sound of a radio playing Fuji music from 3 houses away. He didn't know how long he stood there. His mind wandered to the twins, what they had seen, what they understood, what they might tell their mother. He thought about Clara, about her silence that now seemed louder than any scream. She hadn't confronted him. She hadn't sent threats. Just 2 pairs of eyes to the window. That was more damning than any fight could ever be. Juliet came outside and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her head on his back. "You're overthinking again," she said softly. "Let it go. She's just jealous." David wanted to believe her. He wanted to brush it all off like an accidental spill. But something in his chest told him otherwise. Something told him this wasn't over. That this exact moment was just the matchstick, and the fire was still hiding in the shadows, waiting to be fed. He didn't say any of this aloud. He just nodded and pulled Juliet closer. But in his heart, he knew the wind had already changed, and the silence of the night was not peace, it was warning. Clara had always been a woman wrapped in quietness, the kind that made people uncomfortable not because she said too little, but because it felt like she saw too much. In the compound, she rarely joined morning gossip at the shared tap, or sat on the plastic chairs outside in the evenings when everyone else let the breeze run through their wrappers. If the neighbors knew anything about her at all, it was only what the twins revealed by accident. Nina mentioning that her mummy sometimes cried after dark, or Nita saying she missed her father even though she couldn't remember his face. Clara moved through life like someone who had once lived loudly, but had chosen silence after it broke her. She never raised her voice. She never knocked on anyone's door. But her eyes spoke. They lingered on things most people overlooked. Damp shoes by the stairs, lipstick-stained tumblers in someone else's kitchen sink, and more recently, the shadow of Juliet's shape passing by David's curtains. Her daughters were like her, soft-footed, observant, with a kind of unsettling awareness far beyond their age. David had met Clara first through a bag of beans. She had returned it after buying the wrong size at the market, and he had offered to help her carry it to her kitchen. That was the beginning. No words of interest. No long phone conversations. Just eyes meeting too long, doors left slightly open, and glances that held stories neither of them dared to write in full sentences. It started in the simplest way. He would help her lift heavy things. She would offer him a plate of rice. Then one day, she didn't offer anything except herself, and he didn't say no. There were rules to it, though none spoken. It was always late, always discreet, always timed to the hours when children were asleep, and the compound had surrendered itself to mosquitoes and tired yawns. Clara would knock 3 times, never 4. David would open the door in a white singlet. They didn't talk much. There was no need to. Everything about their arrangement existed in silence, as if to acknowledge it with words would corrupt its balance. For months it worked. No drama, no complaints, just stolen nights and early departures. But something shifted when Juliet arrived. It wasn't just her presence, it was her permanence. Clara noticed. She didn't say it. She didn't need to. Her silence became louder. She stopped sending food. The twins stopped visiting David's house with school assignments. Even when Juliet wasn't around, the distance grew like mold behind a forgotten cupboard. David tried to keep things smooth, pretending he hadn't noticed the change. But it was hard to ignore the way Clara stopped making eye contact, the way she pulled her girls inside the moment he stepped out of his room. The last time Clara came over was the night before Juliet's first full weekend. She hadn't planned it. He hadn't expected her. But there she was, standing at his door, arms crossed, face blank. She didn't ask questions. She didn't accuse him. She kissed him like someone trying to remember what goodbye felt like. And when she left, she didn't look back. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was final. And somehow, that was worse than any slap or scream. David, meanwhile, kept pretending that life was moving on smoothly. He leaned deeper into Juliet's presence like a man leaning into alcohol to forget a name. She was bright, loud, and laughed in a way that filled all the corners of his room. With her, things felt easier. There were no expectations, no history, no silence to read between. She filled his house with perfume, noise, and random shopping bags from online deliveries. But even in the brightness she brought, David could feel the imbalance. Something in his world had cracked. He noticed how children stopped showing up like they used to. He noticed how Juliet would sometimes look out the window and frown without knowing why. And most of all, he noticed the absence of Clara, not just her body but her gaze, her watching, her presence behind the wall. The compound felt different. It breathed differently. One night, while Juliet slept, David sat at his dining table staring at his untouched dinner, listening to the ticking wall clock as if it was counting down to something he couldn't name. He thought of the twins, thought of their eyes, the way they didn't blink, thought of what they might have said, thought of whether Clara was planning something, or if she already had. The quiet had become suffocating. His house had never been this full, and yet felt this hollow. The twins no longer came by, but David felt their absence like a dent on glass. He couldn't unsee the window that had framed their little faces. He found himself avoiding that side of the room now, drawing the curtain tighter even in daylight. Sometimes he thought he heard them giggle outside his door, only to open it and find no one there. Juliet noticed he had grown quieter, more withdrawn. She chalked it up to work stress. He let her believe that. But David knew what was really gnawing at his peace. It was the knowledge that Clara had once trusted him enough to let her children near him, and now they couldn't even make eye contact. The weight of that shift was heavier than guilt. It was like betrayal with a heartbeat. He couldn't undo the past, but he wished he had been more careful with how he layered his present. One evening, he came home to find a small note tucked into the space between his gate and the wall. It was folded 4 times and had no name. He opened it slowly, expecting a warning or insult. Instead, it was blank, except for a single line in faint handwriting that read, "They saw everything. No signature. No context." But he didn't need one. He folded it back, stared at the sunset bleeding over the roofs, and felt his stomach sink. It was beginning. The night it all came crashing down was not loud at first. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that crawled under the skin and made every little sound feel like thunder. Juliet had come over that Friday, this time with a bigger bag than usual. She had packed jeans, 2 pairs of slippers, and a floral nightgown David secretly hated, but never said anything about. She moved around the room humming to herself as though she lived there, as though she had unlocked a door and chosen to never leave. David had picked her up from Bodija earlier that evening, and they had stopped to buy grilled catfish from a roadside vendor. They ate together, laughing, licking pepper from their fingers while leaning against the fridge. There was no tension in the room. No signs of the storm that was silently brewing just across the compound wall. Juliet threw her hair into a messy bun, kicked off her slippers, and made herself comfortable on David's bed. He joined her, one arm wrapped around her waist, the other navigating the television remote like it was his own small form of control. But no remote could silence what was coming. While they lay tangled beneath the fan's soft whir, the compound outside slept lightly. Dogs barked faintly in the distance, generators coughed in and out of rhythm, and the night, heavy with Abaddon heat, sat over the rooftops like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. That was when it happened. There was no knock, no warning. The door swung open with a force that tore the hinges slightly, and slammed it against the wall so hard that Juliet shrieked and rolled off the bed, grabbing the blanket like it could protect her from anything. David sat up, blinking as if waking from a trance. In the doorway stood Clara, barefaced, barefoot, with a wrapper hanging loosely around her chest like she had tied it mid-run. Her arms were stiff at her sides, fists clenched, but it was her eyes, burning red, wild, that struck first. Behind her stood the twins, half hidden in the shadows of the corridor. Clara didn't speak immediately. Her silence didn't ask for permission. It demanded attention. Juliet, now on her feet and holding the blanket to her chest, looked between the woman at the door and the man beside her, confusion unraveling slowly. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice trembling but trying to sound angry. Clara stepped forward, one leg after the other, like a lioness cornering her prey. "You're sleeping with her here?" she finally said, her voice low and cracking like ice on hot pavement. In front of my daughters? David opened his mouth to explain, but nothing came out. Not even a lie. Juliet turned to him sharply. Wait, you're what? She asked, her voice rising. Clara laughed then, short, bitter, the kind of laugh that carried years inside it. Don't act surprised, she said. You think you're the first one he brought here? The room shattered into chaos. Voices flew, curses collided, and all the while, the twins watched, unmoving, their expressions unreadable. The neighbors, ever ready for noise, emerged from their flats like ants from a disturbed colony. Faces peeked from upstairs windows. Some held phones. Others whispered. A few came down with wrappers still tied above their chests and powder on their cheeks. Madame Bimp from flat 2 stood by the corridor, arms crossed, enjoying every bit of it. I said it, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to hear. Juliet was crying now, not because of what Clara said, but because David hadn't denied it. He hadn't fought for her. He hadn't even stood up. Clara, having said what she came to say, stepped back toward the door. But then she turned one last time, looked at David, and spat on the floor beside his shoe. I gave you everything, she said, voice shaking. And you brought another woman into our silence. She walked away with the twins trailing her like shadows. Not once did they look back. Juliet packed her things in silence. No tears. No shouting. Just anger thick enough to burn through her eyes. David tried to talk, but she brushed past him like a stranger on a busy street. You lied with ease, she whispered before stepping out the door. But you couldn't lie for me now. And just like that, she was gone. The compound grew quiet again, but it was no longer the calm of a peaceful night. It was the silence after a house has crumbled. David didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, shirtless, sweating, staring at the floor like it held the answer to a riddle he had forgotten how to solve. He replayed the scene over and over, not because he wanted to feel guilt, but because he didn't know what to do with the emptiness now sitting in his chest like a boulder. There was no message from Clara. No knock from the twins. The air around his flat had changed. It was no longer welcoming. It was cautious, judgmental, and maybe rightfully so. The children who used to run in with drawings and laughter stayed away now. Their absence was louder than their voices had ever been. David's house became too quiet. His television remote lay untouched. The fridge remained full. Nobody came to ask for Ribena. Nobody asked for help with math homework. It was as though the laughter had been evicted along with Juliet. And in the silence, David began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not guilt, not shame, but loss. A strange, irreversible kind of loss. Like he had torn a fabric that could never be mended. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't explain away the way Clara's eyes had looked or the way the twins had watched him like a storybook villain. For the first time in a long time, he realized he wasn't the favorite anymore. He was just another man who had built comfort with dishonesty and watched it rot in real time. David woke up the next morning and immediately knew something had shifted, not in his bones, but in the air around him. The stillness of the room was too complete, like silence had built itself a permanent home inside his walls. Sunlight filtered through the curtains half-heartedly, casting lines across the floor as if even the light was reluctant to enter. He sat up slowly, unsure whether it was morning or afternoon, and looked around the room with the hazy disorientation of someone returning to a crime scene. The blanket Juliet had clutched was still on the floor, twisted and limp, and her faint perfume lingered in the room like a stubborn ghost. He didn't touch it. Instead, he wandered to the window, pulling the curtain aside with fingers that trembled not from cold, but from the weight of too many regrets pressing against his skin. The compound was alive but subdued. A woman was hanging laundry to dry, humming under her breath. A boy was bouncing a flat football against a wall, but not near David's door. No one knocked. No one passed by. He realized, with an ache in his chest, that he had become a door people avoided. He stayed at the window longer than he meant to, watching nothing in particular, just listening to the dull, ordinary sounds of a life he had slowly been cut off from. The children who once barged in without permission now avoided eye contact when passing. He wasn't just alone. He was isolated. The days that followed became a blur of repetition. David moved through them like a man dragging an invisible weight, going through the motions but with no intention behind them. He cleaned the house more than usual, wiped counters that were already clean, rearranged books he never planned to read, checked the fridge for no reason. But the silence never left. It filled the space between his steps, stretched out in the hallway, lingered in the corners. Occasionally a knock would come, someone delivering something he didn't remember ordering, a neighbor asking to borrow a mop, but none of them stayed long. They all left quickly, like people avoiding a house rumored to be haunted. Even his phone remained mostly quiet. Juliet never called. Clara didn't reply the one message he had dared to send. And the twins, he didn't see them anymore. Not outside, not at the tap, not even from his window. It was like they had vanished, taken their small footsteps and laughter, and tucked them away somewhere safe, somewhere far from him. Once, late at night, he heard what he thought was the sound of children playing and rushed to the window, only to realize it was coming from another compound. That was the moment he understood what he had lost was not just affection, it was presence. People had stopped showing up for him. Even his own reflection in the mirror seemed unsure of its loyalty. He had become a man living in echoes. Clara's flat, which had once emitted faint sounds of cooking and low conversations between mother and daughters, now held the silence of a house preparing to disappear. The windows remained shut at all times. The door was no longer left slightly open in the evenings. Even the plants she had once tended with care, those little pots of scent leaves and bitter leaf by the kitchen window, had begun to dry out. David stared at them one afternoon, thinking about how even plants seemed to respond to heartbreak. No one told him when she left. It happened quietly, the way most meaningful things end. He came back one evening from a short walk to buy suya and noticed her door was padlocked. The curtains were gone. A neighbor confirmed it the next day without being asked, as if offering small talk. Ah, she carry go since Saturday. Na night she pack, nobody hear am. That was it. No drama. No second confrontation. Just absence. David felt it like a punch he had no time to dodge. He tried to picture the moment she left, Clara waking the twins gently, packing bags in the dark, making sure not to slam any doors. He imagined her pausing at the door, taking one last look at the compound before walking away from everything. And maybe she had smiled. Or maybe she hadn't. He would never know. All he knew was that something had ended, not just between them, but within him. Something had been removed from his world, and now there was a space too exact to ignore. What remained after Clara's departure was not silence, it was vacancy. An absence that couldn't be filled by sound or distraction. It was the kind of emptiness that had its own temperature, its own smell. David began to move slower, as if afraid that walking too fast would scatter the fragile stillness he was now surrounded by. Sometimes he sat outside in the evening, pretending to read a newspaper while watching the entrance of the compound, hoping, foolishly, desperately, that Clara might return for something forgotten. A pot, a book, anything. But she never did. On one of those evenings, just as the sky was beginning to swallow the sun, he saw the twins again. It had been weeks. They were walking past the compound gate with another woman, probably a relative. They had new shoes. Their hair was done in neat cornrows. They looked different, slightly taller, older somehow. They didn't stop. They didn't wave. But as they passed, both turned their heads in the same slow motion, their eyes locking with David's for the briefest moment. It was enough. It wasn't anger in their eyes. It wasn't confusion. It was something quieter, something heavier. Disappointment. The kind that didn't need to be shouted or explained. And then they looked away, continuing their walk without pause. David sat there for a long time after, the newspaper forgotten in his lap, the sky turning purple around him. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, like a man who had finally realized that some bridges don't burn. They fade, and one day, you look up and find there's no path left at all. David began to notice that even the wind no longer passed by his window the same way it used to. There was something muted about the way it stirred the curtains now, as if even the breeze understood it was no longer welcome there. He stayed inside more, avoided the compound like it was sacred ground he had desecrated. The children never came around again, not even to knock and run, not even to peek through the door. His apartment, once filled with playful footsteps and juice boxes littered on the floor, had become a museum of stillness. The cartoons he used to leave running in the background for company now irritated him, and the remote control lay untouched, collecting dust like a forgotten memory. He cleaned the house often, but it never looked clean enough, as though the stains weren't on the walls but in the air itself. It wasn't guilt anymore. It had transformed into a kind of ache, dull and permanent, like the slow erosion of something once bright. He had expected the pain to come in waves, but it came in stillness, came in the moments when his hands were idle and his mind wandered into spaces he had no permission to visit. He began to withdraw from everyone. If a neighbor greeted him, he offered a nod. If someone knocked, he pretended not to hear. Every sound was suspicious now. Every movement outside his window carried the potential of memory, and David had come to fear memory more than consequence. One morning, David walked out to the front of the compound and stood under the mango tree, the one that had shaded the children while they played, the one that had dropped fruit at the perfect moment to interrupt awkward silences. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching the street like a man waiting for something that would never arrive. His neighbors passed without looking his way. A few of them still whispered, though not as loudly as before. The scandal had become old news, buried under new gossip, but the stain remained. It clung to him like a smell no soap could remove. He thought about moving out many times, considered it seriously. He even searched listings on his phone, visited a couple of places in Bodija and Agodi, but nothing felt right. Every house he walked into felt either too clean or too new, and he realized he wasn't looking for a fresh start. He was looking for something to punish him. A place with cracks, with shadows, something broken enough to reflect how he felt inside. He returned home after each search more hollow than before. That evening, while clearing old books from his bottom drawer, he found a drawing. A child's drawing. Two stick figures holding a balloon, with Uncle David, written in the top corner in red crayon. He stared at it for a long time, trying to remember who had drawn it. It could have been Nina. Or maybe Nita. He wasn't sure anymore. What haunted him most was that he couldn't remember the last time they had smiled at him. He started writing letters he never sent. Pages filled with sentences that began with "if I could go back," and ended with apologies soaked in silence. He addressed some of them to Clara, others to the twins, and a few to himself. He didn't write to Juliet, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what he would say. He folded each letter carefully, and placed them inside a shoebox under his bed. He told himself it was closure, but deep down he knew it was just another way to delay letting go. On a cold Wednesday morning, he left a final envelope at Clara's door, though he wasn't sure if she or anyone would ever find it. Her apartment remained locked, untouched since the day she vanished into the folds of the city. He had written the letter without flourish. No dramatics. No last-minute confessions. Just a simple page where he wrote, in careful handwriting, "I forgot that children see everything. I failed you. But most of all, I failed them. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I hope one day I'll deserve it." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The words were heavier than his name. That night, he slept for the first time in weeks. Not peacefully, not deeply, but long enough to dream. And in his dream, he was back in his living room with the twins beside him, laughing at something on the screen. No sados, no silence, just the sound of their giggles. Life in the compound carried on without him. New tenants moved into Clara's flat eventually, a couple with a newborn whose cries echoed across the walls like reminders of everything David had lost. Children returned to playing in the yard, though they never wandered near his door. His place had become a landmark, a memory that parents reference quietly when telling their children about mistakes you must not repeat. He didn't mind. He accepted it. One evening, just as the sky was folding into night, he stood by his window and watched a mother walk her child down the road. The child, no older than 4, pointed at his building. The mother leaned down and whispered something that made the child nod solemnly. David didn't feel insulted. He felt understood. He knew he had become a story. Not a cautionary tale. Not a lesson. Just a story. One told in pieces, with names forgotten, but feelings remembered. And perhaps that was enough. He began to write again, not letters, but thoughts. He filled notebooks with reflections, stories about people who had loved too quietly, or left too loudly. In the final page of one notebook, he wrote just 7 words. "Some windows don't need curtains, just closure." He closed the book, placed it on the shelf, and turned off the light. In the darkness, he didn't feel fear or regret. Just a strange, still acceptance. And sometimes, that's the closest a man can get to peace. Sometimes, the things we take for granted are the very things holding our peace together. Don't play with trust, whether it's from a friend, a partner, or a child's quiet admiration. When people give you access to their heart, respect the space. The eyes that watch you in silence today may carry the stories of your choices tomorrow. Be wise. Don't lose something good just to feel something new. May your steps never lead you to regret. May your presence bring light, not shadows. May your name open doors, not wounds. May you never trade peace for pleasure. May the ones who watch you, children, loved ones, heaven, find joy, not sorrow, in your actions. May your heart know when to stop, and your mind know when to walk away. And when life tests your character, may you pass with grace, wisdom, and mercy. If this spoke to your soul, say a big, loud Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.